People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Enjoy.
Thanks, brother. Before we have our esteemed guest come up, I just wanted to touch base. If you remember, she was here last in 2022. This is the third time she's been with us since 2019, so we're blessed. We are really blessed, and I hope you realize that. Well, if you'll remember, for you fine folks that were with us 3 years ago, I got up and briefly mentioned how we were in the middle, as far as her social media, we were in the middle of a shadow ban. And if you'll remember, the speech she gave 3 years ago was taken down within an hour of it being posted on YouTube with a strike against the North Carolina Party account. So tonight is not going to be live streamed, it's going to be recorded, so at least if it gets taken down later, we'll have an archive of what happened here tonight. But happy to say, for some weird reason, May of last year, exactly about a year ago, the ban lifted. If I look at the stats, it went from flatline to peak, and it's still rising. And at that time, I asked my friends in North Carolina to share her material and help, beat this algorithm that was, working against us. And I'm sure due to that and hard work from us, and we're doing a little bit better. Now, at that time, for a 28-day period, we were getting at that time just like 77,000, which was not a whole lot at all. But I'll just give you, I've got a couple screenshots. The last 28 days on Facebook, her content's been viewed 3.9 million times, and she's garnered 4,000 followers on Facebook the last 28 days. Instagram, the last 28 days, her content's been viewed 2.4 million times, and she's picked up 1,100 followers.
Mary rocks.
So yeah, she rocks, and it's because of her and her decades of dedication to this party and her reputation. I give her the credit for this, and I'm pleased, and it's a blessing to be her friend and to introduce her tonight. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the bio because that could take an hour. Inside and outside the movement, what hasn't she done? But again, North Carolina, I want you to appreciate what a gift you have tonight and through the years. She's one of us. Many of y'all may remember she lived here for 4 years, and this is her home party, and it's such a blessing for her to share this, because this was a last minute thing. I didn't think I could get her, but she thinks so well of us and Rob, and she couldn't say no. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the heart and soul of not only the Libertarian Party, but the Liberty Movement as a whole, Dr. Mary Ruwart.
Thank you for that warm welcome. As you know, I feel like this is my second home, even though I'm currently based out of Texas. I'm actually here much more than I am in Michigan, which was my birth state and where I was for most of my early life. So thank you for inviting me, and hopefully we won't have to worry about censorship for this particular talk, but you never know. Because today I am talking about, does the CDC's vaccine schedule help or harm your child? And you might recall in 2022, I talked about the COVID vaccine and some of the adverse effects that we were seeing. And that got me interested in looking further in this space. And that's why I'm doing the talk I am today. And I hope that everyone who has children or grandchildren will at least consider what's in this talk. And we shouldn't ever have any problem saying that libertarians don't care about the children after you see what the government has done. So first, I do need to make a disclaimer. I am not a medical doctor. I am a PhD researcher. I do not give medical advice, but I can share what I know from research, and in many cases, the research is a couple decades or so ahead of what actually happens in medical practice. Unfortunately, we do not, or are not able to, for reasons I guess we could debate. The things that happen in research don't occur till many decades later in medical practice oftentimes, which is quite sad. But let's get to the meat of things. So, I want to talk about the National Vaccine Injury Act of 1986 and give you a little background of what happened back then. So there were two pharmaceutical companies at that point making all the vaccines that were used in this country. And they both were going to go out of business. Why? Because they had too many liability suits for their vaccines, which is really not unusual in the pharmaceutical space, which you know I'm very well acquainted with. And the reason is that it's a biologic. It's a mixture of antigens and other things, sometimes fetal embryo parts, and other biological things. And you know, our bodies, they aren't always very tolerant of things that are foreign. And the body does not have a good way to detoxify biologics compared to the average drug, which basically is a single compound with some what we call excipients in it, which means, you know, fillers and things that keeps it from getting wet, things like that. These are much more complex things, and so it was expected that that would happen. And as you can see from this slide, part of the reason this Vaccine Injury Act was passed, because in the process, there was an acknowledgement of what I've basically just told you. The Supreme Court says vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. So what the manufacturers wanted, if they were to stay in business, would be for the government, AKA the taxpayer, to take the brunt of the adverse reactions that were happening, and they would be the ones to make the victims of some of these unsafe vaccines whole again. So to do that, as we'll talk about in a little bit, they established a government vaccine court with the taxpayer footing the bill. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, what happened as a consequence of this is that we had a big increase in the number of vaccines. In 1984, there were about 13 vaccines that your child or grandchild might be given, and that included several booster doses. But by 2025, we had about 72 vaccines that children got before they turned 18, and that included booster doses. This does not include the COVID vaccine, by the way. So why this big increase? Well, now that the pharmaceutical companies were not on the hook for any liability, they just kept producing vaccines. And unfortunately, our FDA did not do a very good job in the way they evaluated and approved these. In fact, what happened in most cases is they did not test the vaccines against a true placebo. What they did is they tested it against another vaccine. So if the quote, placebo vaccine had side effects and the new vaccine had the same number of side effects, then it would look like there are no adverse side effects for the new vaccine, because you've got two entities that have approximately the same number of side effects. This is not proper science. And in this sense, our FDA failed us Maybe not so unusual given what happened during the COVID years. And I won't repeat that because I already talked about it. The vaccine schedule for children now 18 years or younger looks kind of like this. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I just thought you might appreciate a graphic of what children are subjected to go to public schools usually. And also, I wanted to point out that I personally would not take 72 vaccines as an adult. I would consider that to be asking for trouble, because your immune system, when it sees these antigens, will react, but it can only react appropriately a certain number of times, especially when you get boosters. That process has been shown to be a little bit of questionable medicine, I guess I'd say, because what happens is when your body sees the same thing over and over and over again, it can get the idea that this is self and not foreign. And it really kind of tricks the immune system. So this can be bad. And the other part about this I want to emphasize is that, of course, if you actually get a disease and survive it, you're going to have much better immunity than if you get it through a vaccine. That's been known for all the decades that we've had vaccines. Now, let's talk about the actual compensation program. So, this was established and sold to the American public as a quick way for vaccine-injured children to get help. But it actually acts more like a court, except there aren't any real judges. They are bureaucrats that have been appointed. And of course, their job is to protect the government from having to pay things out. Nevertheless, as you can see, they basically paid out over $4 billion in about the first 30 years that this existed. And what do you think that the most of the payouts went to? Anyone want to guess which vaccine? The flu shot.
Oh, yeah.
The flu shot, yeah. Now, there are some vaccines that they won't even allow into the court anymore. I don't have a list of those here for you. But obviously, as maybe to be expected, the courts are protecting the government more than they are protecting the children. And so it is still a long process to get any compensation, even though it was sold to the public and especially to the people who were concerned about vaccines as something that was going to be quicker compensation than what they had already. I want to move on to some studies that came out of vaccinated children and unvaccinated children for comparison. And here, in this graphic, what you can see is that unvaccinated children compared to vaccinated ones had much less chronic illness, eczema, neurodegeneration, autism, ADHD, and learning disabilities. This study came out, as you can see, oh, maybe I didn't have, 2017. So this study's been out for a fair number of years. Now, one pediatrician had figured out that he wasn't comfortable with giving the CDC's schedule of vaccines. He felt that he was seeing too many side effects. So he wrote this book, The Vaccine-Friendly Plan, where what he did is he spaced out some of these vaccines because he felt he would probably have fewer side effects in his patients if he did so. And in the times when he was practicing, if a patient came to a doctor, a pediatrician, and said, you know, I really like to space out the vaccines. I don't want to play catch up. Maybe we don't need this one or that one. Basically, if the mom or the father or the parents collectively did not want to get a full vaccine schedule, they got kicked out of the practice. And they came to Dr. Paul Thomas because he would take them and he would give what he felt was full informed consent. Well, this didn't sit well with the medical board. So they called him in and said, you have to prove to us that your vaccine-friendly plan is as good as the CDC's plan. So he hired a researcher to come in and look at the data he had collected over the years. And basically, what he saw, and I know this, I'm gonna do better for you in the next slide, because I know you can't read what's going on here, but let me just tell you, what he did is he measured the cumulative office visits that his patients had, and he had enough totally unvaxxed subjects that he was able to show in all of these lines that you can see, and I'm going to show you a chart so it's going to be easier for you to read. He would see his vaccinated or unvaccinated patients having lower incidence of a variety of disabilities or diseases than his vaxxed patients, even on his vaccine-friendly plan, many of them, they still had more problems. Now, as I said, the next slide, most of the slides I'm showing in this presentation, by the way, are Paul Thomas's. And at the end, I'm going to put up a graphic so you can help support him, if you'd like, in his fights against this kind of stuff. So I made a table so you could more easily see what he was seeing. And as you can tell, there's a great number of disorders here. And I want to talk to you a little bit about these numbers that you're seeing. This is called a p-value. And I don't expect any of you to know what that is if you're not in the sciences, but I think it shows us something that you can easily understand if I just explain it. So you've probably heard that people say, well, this study didn't show a significant difference. This study did not show that this drug worked. Well, what they do to make that conclusion is they look for a statistical p-value of what they call 0.05. This means, in plain English, that the result that you're seeing has less than a 5% chance of being wrong. And it's totally arbitrary. We could have said less than 0.01, and that would be less than 10% chance that the conclusion is wrong. But if you look at these numbers, they are much, much smaller than 0.05. This is, I don't want to say unheard of in biology, but this is so strong, it can't be by chance. And the only one that didn't show up to be significant is seizure, which this might not be true for a COVID vaccine, but for the CDC vaccine schedule, that seems to be the only insignificant parameter. And I show you this just to show how really strong this data is. It's not something that you can explain away by saying, oh, there weren't enough patients, because statistics takes that into account. And the fact that you've got so many different things that are going wrong with these children, it's very highly significant. So he showed this to the medical board, which is what they asked for. And they also wanted to publish this and they actually got it accepted in the peer-reviewed journal of the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. But the medical board wasn't happy. So its response was to basically threaten and eventually take away Dr. Paul Thomas's license to practice medicine. So it's not about the results, it's about what the politics, the political reality of vaccines are really all about. Now, Paul Thomas's study wasn't the only one. You saw the 2017 study, and after Paul Thomas did that, there was another study that came out from Brian Hooker and Neil Miller, which basically showed, I'm not gonna really go through this, but a similar situation with, again, very strong p-values until you come to gastrointestinal disorder or head injury. Well, you wouldn't expect head injury to cause developmental delay unless, of course, it was so severe that you didn't recover. So this isn't really strange. It gives more credence to the fact that the vaccine schedule is responsible for these types of problems that children have. Now, another thing that Paul Thomas figured out, and I don't think he was unique in this, I suspected the same thing even though this wasn't my scientific space, and I'm sure others did too, was that there's a reason that maybe the US has, compared to other countries, has more early deaths in children. And let's see, I forgot what this, oh yes, this is the international schedule. So in other words, it seems to match the schedules. And I just want to point out something. I didn't say this before, but I think it's really important. The Hep B vaccine is given on the first day of life. Now, I worked for a company that put out a loss leader drug in order to stabilize newborns so that in 3 days they could have an operation that would save their lives. If they didn't have that operation, they'd die. But they didn't give it that operation on the first day of life, and the reason is they weren't stable enough for surgery. So think about this. The first day of life for most of our infants is that they are going to get a hepatitis B vaccine. Now, if the mother is hepatitis B positive, that's one thing. But if a child is going to contract it, they have to be usually sexually promiscuous, which most newborns are not, or they have to be engaged in something, in other words, they have to interact with somebody who has hepatitis or get a blood transfusion that hasn't been properly screened or something like that. Most children, of course, don't fall into that category. Now, one of the things that people found, and I've given you the reference here again, is that the infant mortality, here's the vaccine doses down here, infant mortality here, and what you can see is the more vaccines the kids got, the more likely they were to die for what's known as sudden infant death syndrome. And this is something that when I was a youngster, this was not happening. But of course that was pre-86. Now it's very common. And why would that be? Well, one of the things that most vaccines have as an adjuvant is aluminum. Aluminum is a pretty toxic mineral for us. And even though we use aluminum foil in our cooking, for example, we are ingesting it orally. So only about 1% of it is absorbed. But when you actually give an injection, like a vaccine, 100% of that aluminum is absorbed. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, these graphs are showing you the percent of time that babies from birth to 7 months have with aluminum levels above and beyond what the FDA recommends. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing that 70% of the birth to 7-month infant, they are way above, 70% above what are the, basically the dangerous level that the FDA has found. And with the modified CDC schedule, I don't know what that modification is exactly, but it's lower. And then the vaccine-friendly plan that Dr. Thomas had, it was way lower, about 5% of the time. And here's birth to 2 years. You can see those aluminum levels are still high. Now, that's not the only thing that could be problematic in the vaccines. There's a lot of other things in vaccines. But I thought that was probably one of the worst. And an easy thing to show you, because almost all vaccines have aluminum. And you might say, why don't they just take it out? Well, the reason they don't take it out is because then the vaccine wouldn't work. Why? Because just injecting the antigen, which of course is maybe the part of the bacterial coat, or a dead virus, or what we call an attenuated virus, which means it's not as bad as the real thing. When we use that type of antigen, which is what all vaccines use, it's not enough to stimulate the immune system. So the aluminum is put in there to really kind of make a little inflammation around the site where the vaccine goes in. And that helps the immune system kick in gear, so to speak. Okay. So, where does that leave everything? Well, right now, and I'm going to have this slide as the last slide of my talk in just a minute. I'm going to show you a few others and then go back to this one so that you can, write down anything you want. I wanted to show you first Paul Thomas's second book. And the reason that's important is he goes through every single vaccine on the childhood schedule and gives you, tells you what the chances of that child getting a severe reaction to the vaccine and what chances of the child catching the disease and not making a good recovery, because that information is out there in the research. And basically the bottom line is there's very few things that, very few vaccines that don't have more side effects than they have protection against a disease that is common. So some of these diseases aren't common. We saw that for the hepatitis vaccine, and most of the other ones are in the same boat. But the nice thing about this book is if you're thinking, well, I want to give my child some vaccines, this is a really good place to look for information about which ones you might want to give. Now, because Paul Thomas no longer has his medical license, he can speak out the way he wants to. And so he decided he was going to go ahead and do some podcasts on children's health defense. And also, this is his website right here, doctorsandscience.com. And there's a way to support his fight with the medical board, although I don't know that he's really doing that much anymore. I'd suggest you go here and take a look at that if you want to know more about him. And as I said, I'm going to just remind you of a couple other things. First of all, I do have my books here, and you probably all know that. I've been sitting at the table in the afternoon, and so many of you have come up and said hi, so thank you. I feel very welcome here. And I'd also like to point out, as chair of Liberty International, that in this August, we are going to be in Buenos Aires. And we have the hope that we will be visited by Javier. And we think that's got a high probability of happening. And for those of you who don't know him, he is the Libertarian president of Argentina. And I think he did some wonderful things. We had a congressman from Argentina in our Grapevine conference, the World Conference we had in Grapevine, just last November. And so if you can join us in August, it would be great. But if you can't, I know you all want to be there, whether you feel like you can go or not. We are going to be streaming, I believe, what's going on at the conference, and so that's something that hopefully we'll have more information on the website about. So I'm going to open up for questions, and I'm going to leave this slide up. So if you want to know more about Dr. Paul Thomas, and remember a lot of these slides came from a presentation he posted, then I'll answer questions while you copy information or decide if that's something that really excites you. Yes, Sean?
Yeah, I'm hoping this is a softball question. But you know, in the news right now are fresh outbreaks of measles, including one in West Texas. It's getting a lot of publicity right now. And it seemed like we had pretty much made the news, and now it's coming back. So, you know,
What's up with that?
yeah,
Why?
what's up with that?
Yeah,
basically?
okay. So, the thing about the measles vaccine is it does not give lifelong immunity. Now, I had measles when I was a kid, so presumably I have 75 years. That's what they consider a lifetime.
Yeah.
But if you get the vaccine for mumps, measles, any of that, you need boosters because it doesn't last as long. And that's the difference between having the childhood disease and so many of the Texas outbreak folks are vaccinated children. And the thing about it is vaccinated, at least this is, I think I should say, this is probably the understanding, which could be a little flawed, I don't know yet, I haven't looked at that, but the children that are vaccinated, as they're going through this transition of losing their immunity, can actually catch measles and they can carry it without having symptoms. So this is a concern as well. So I don't think we can eradicate some of these childhood diseases through vaccines. It's very hard because the immunity from the vaccine just isn't as good as what happens when you get the disease. And so for parents and grandparents, it really is something to consider. You have to think about, okay, a few people can die from measles, and actually some of the children that died in Texas were more because the doctors that cared for them didn't realize what supportive treatments they could give children with measles, since they haven't seen it very much until the outbreak, right? So there's been a number of doctors that have looked at what happened to some of the children in Texas, and at least some of them died not because of the measles. They died because of the improper treatment of the measles.
Okay.
And then there are also concerns that have been expressed that the measles that you get, and you can actually test for this, the measles that you get from being vaccinated and then contracting something, it seems like the measles virus has mutated, and so it's more virulent today than it was back in my day. At least this is, again, what people are thinking, and this, may be partially true. I don't quite know because the science is still evolving, so that is another factor.
Well, I have a follow-up question on that, because you said it's difficult to eradicate a disease through vaccinations. But we seem to have completely eradicated smallpox. How did we do that?
Yeah, and that's a
Not through
good,
vaccinations.
I'm glad you asked that question. It appears that if you look at a graph of smallpox and you look at when the vaccine came in, what you see is the smallpox incidence was going down, then the vaccine came in and went down further. So most of the, of getting rid of the smallpox was probably due to sanitation changes and nutritional changes. Sanitation, of course, in the early 1900s, was pretty poor.
Yeah.
I can speak actually to the business about having nutritional food. I remember going to the marketplace when I was preschool, and my mom would take me shopping, and the produce section we had was maybe as big as 2 of these tables. And I was in Michigan at the time. It was always foods that lasted a long time. Apples, potatoes,
Yeah.
occasionally oranges, but those were seasonal. Lemons occasionally, again, somewhat seasonal. And we didn't have refrigerated trucks going back and forth throughout the country at that time, but we do now. and so even if our food may not quite have the nutritional content that it used to, we have so much more variety. And we have frozen food too, which back then, the frozen food was terrible.
Yes.
Yeah, so you probably remember too. We're about the same age.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I have a different question too, but I don't want to hog the whole floor. If anybody else has questions.
Okay, well, let's see if somebody else has questions, then we come back if they don't.
Okay. Well, of course now, I'm seeing doctors a lot, getting into the age that I am. And they're trying to push all these kinds of vaccines on me now for RCV, for shingles, and I had smallpox. I mean, chicken pox before, so, and I've actually had shingles before, which went away because I changed my diet, as far as I'm concerned. But, and of course the flu shot, they keep pushing on me too.
Yes.
So do you have any commentary on this new push to try to get older people vaccinated for all these different things?
Well, I think the medical schools have been teaching doctors that vaccines are safe and effective. Which if that was really true, we would never have passed the Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. And we never would have been down to 2 pharmaceutical manufacturers either that were going out of business because of the liability suits. But they are told that the side effects from vaccines are 1 in a million. This does not line up with the literature. So again, I think this is something that we've indoctrinated into our doctors, and if they don't toe the line on vaccines, they know from instances like Dr. Paul's that they can be, or Paul Thomas, that they can be called in front of their medical board and be treated like he was. So this is, and there are doctors that will fire you even as a senior for being a patient if you don't take the vaccines. I think we're gonna see some changes in that, especially if Robert Kennedy Jr. is able to start, basically what he said is he's going to start demanding a saline and true placebo for new vaccines, and what that will do is call into question some of these other vaccines. So if that actually happens, things may change. But right now, the doctors really, truly believe, for the most part, in this 1 out of a million.
Well, now that's something I've heard as a pushback to RFK Jr.'s statement about that, is that people say, well, we already do these placebo trials. Is that the case?
Well, obviously, we don't do true placebos. We match them against another vaccine. So if
Are we gonna do placebos on setting broken bones? Like, somebody's got a broken bone, we're not gonna say, hey, let's let half these guys not set, and then set the other half.
Well, it's a very simple mechanical procedure.
Yes,
Yeah, well-
but I'm just saying there are more sophisticated arguments than, I think part of the problem with Kennedy, from my perspective, is that it's like the people who wanted to argue against evolution. They would say, oh, it's just a theory. So they were using the language of science as a weapon against science. And I feel like some of Kennedy's stuff is the same kind of thing. He's trying to use the language of science against it. I don't know.
well, obviously,
I'm not the expert on vaccines that Kennedy is.
yeah, well, I think, yes. And, that's true, because medical practice is treated differently. So, for example, when we started to have transplantation, which people my age in this room remember, the heart transplants in South Africa, I think it was, You know, everybody was saying, this is terrible, you know, we're killing
Soulless,
people.
they're gonna have no souls.
Yeah.
Their souls are gonna battle one another, or, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
artificial insemination too, and all that stuff.
Yes.
In vitro, yes.
yes. And so transplantation is now a common thing, it saves a lot of lives. That's medical practice. Now, of course, as a libertarian, I'm like, yeah, I mean, if somebody wants to take a drug that hasn't been fully tested, that's their prerogative, especially if they're dying, you know, and this is the only chance they have. But I think if you're going to have a regulatory body and you're going to have drug approval, you at least want it to be of a quality that you can believe in to some extent. And I think this has been, well, I mean, I would say this. Some people would consider the way vaccines have been tested against another vaccine could be construed as fraud. I mean, that is not a true scientific test. And of course, maybe what we should be doing is treating drugs just like we treat medical treatments, because yes, for example, open heart surgery was found after several decades of it being used, that it only was really effective for people who had 3 or 4 arteries blocked. And so a lot of people got that surgery that didn't need it. That's the downside of allowing, you know, the kind of treatments to evolve that evolve rapidly and are innovative. And then, of course, there's the whole other aspect. One of the things, just a quick blurb on stem cells. Now, stem cells are the cells of your body that are kind of like embryonic cells, and they can go to different parts of your body and become part of your knee cartilage, or they can go into your heart and repair the heart. But now the FDA has gotten involved in this. And for example, there was a young, I guess probably a teenager in Michigan, who was working with a nail gun, and he fired one into his heart. Yeah, he was taken to a hospital, as you might imagine, and of course his prognosis was poor. And it was poor because what happens when your heart gets that much damage, you keep having one heart attack after another until you die.
Yeah.
And so what the doctors did, knowing this kid did not have any other chance, is they took his blood, isolated the stem cells, and injected them into his heart. Beaumont Hospital in Michigan. And lo and behold, it worked. So 3 months later, he's out playing basketball with his friends. This is pretty neat. So the doctors that treated him said, ooh, we could do this. We could take cardiac patients who are going to die within the year because we don't have any treatment for them. We could take their stem cells and treat them. And what we could do is we could do a clinical study. And so all clinical studies in this country have to be approved by an IRB, an institutional review board, a group of people who make sure that informed consent is properly given. And also the FDA gets to weigh in. The FDA said, no, you can't do that stem cell research unless you have all these animal studies that we require for drugs. Well, the hospital didn't have an animal facility, it had people. So, yeah, they couldn't, you know, to farm this out, there are places that will do animal studies for you, but to farm that out would have cost millions. So, of course, that study
But
did not get done.
these were all people that didn't have any other recourse.
You got it, they were gonna die in a year.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
So they got to torture a bunch of eagles in our name.
Damage them and then.
That's a responsible thing to do.
Well,
Right.
I'm-
Damage them and then
Yeah.
treat them.
Yeah.
Now, adding on to this, a few years before, a guy out in Colorado, a doctor out in Colorado, Centeno, Dr. Centeno was his name. He was treating athletes, and then he wanted to start treating the elderly. And what he quickly found out is when he tried to inject stem cells from the elderly back into their body, it just wasn't enough to help their injured tissue because, of course, repair is slower in older.
It's a nice step.
You got it. And so what happened is, he figured out a way to take those stem cells out of elderly people, grow them up for about a week, So there'd be lots of stem cells in the test tube, so to speak, and then inject them back. And lo and behold, it was great. Now the elderly can also recover. But the FDA said, we're taking you to court. Because when you manipulate those stem cells by growing them in a test tube, they become a drug.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
And, you know, we talked just a little bit earlier about transplantation and innovative things in bone setting. And of course, doctors are allowed to, you know, do medical procedures like that. But once the FDA declares it a drug, it's got to jump through the 12 to 14 years of hoops that you guys have, I think, you've heard me talk about in other talks.
Just them multiplying, being exactly the same, but just multiplying, that's a
Correct,
drug.
yes.
Which is what you all want Kennedy to do with vaccines. Whatever.
I mean, and so if you want, I don't want to leave it hanging, you can get this treatment, but you got to go to the Bahamas.
Okay.
Not too
Good
bad
to
of a
know.
vacation.
Medical tourism, thank you, that's good to know.
But if you don't have enough money to buy the ticket, you're out of luck. And so this is another instance where government that says it's for the poor actually is not. So,
I just have an anecdotal, when I've told my doctor that when I was younger, my mother would take, I remember vividly my mother taking us to children that had the measles or the mumps,
Yes.
and taking us there.
mhm.
And why are we going? I don't know that person. Well, he's not feeling well, we need to go and say hello. And they look at me with horror, what my mother did, but, you know, we all got that, we were all fine, you know.
Right. I mean, that's what they did in my neighborhood as well.
Yeah, she's like, oh, let's go see Bobby, he has the measles. I don't like Bobby. Well, we should say, you know, we should be kind.
Yeah, or chicken pox.
Or anything else,
mumps,
yes.
yes.
Also served, since you have 4 children, to put all of the sickness into 2 weeks instead of 10 days here, 10 days here, 10 days here, 10 days here.
Right.
So, worked out well.
Yeah.
But the horror, there's kind of a horrified look on medical practitioners, younger ones' faces when you tell them that story.
Well, they are told that those childhood diseases are dangerous, and yes, people can die from them. But it's rare, and usually it's a child that's already compromised. I mean, a child that's compromised already has a lot more problems than a healthy child. So anyhow, I just, I wanted to share this information with you because I felt it was valuable. And then you can do what you want with it. And I hope that this has been informative, and I'm happy to answer other questions. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I have an excellent question. So the study looked like it had a lot of correlation in it.
Mhm.
So knowing that most people who do not vaccinate their child or delay that schedule tend to be better educated, and by extension, one can infer healthier meals, more organic food in the house, better schedule for sleep for the child. So if the child has already got a leg up by being healthier, how do those studies account for that? Like that correlation, if you start with a healthier child who's being better taken care of, that also impacts the outcome of anything as far as the health of that child. So where did the studies that you were looking at, how did they take into account those other factors,
I don't-
socioeconomic and otherwise?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't think that they did, frankly, but that's why the p-value was so important. If it had been due to factors like that, one would have expected a much less robust correlation. The numbers that I showed you for the p-values are extremely unusual on clinical studies. So this is me talking, not the paper. I would be very surprised if there would be any factor like, but that's my interpretation.
My experience being in a Walmart at, let's say, 8 p.m. on a Friday, you see obese 2-year-olds
Yes.
drinking soda. So
Yes.
there's a lot of factors
Mhm.
that create that situation as well, or I set that kid up for failure.
Yes, I mean, if your child is healthy, perhaps you do better. It's a little difficult to know, because one of the things when I was looking at the COVID vaccines, I noticed that the studies from Britain indicated that people who were 80 years or older saw absolutely no benefit from the COVID vaccine in terms of immunity. And it seemed to me, again, this is a little bit of speculation on my part, I haven't seen a study on this, but it seemed to me that the people who were dying from the COVID shot tended to be young, healthy people. And for example, the insurance companies were reporting that the people they insured, which were professionals, life insurance we're talking, that they normally are the healthiest people in their insurance bracket, other than maybe children, you know, of the working class, I should say, the working class, they were the healthiest. But what happened is they all of a sudden became the worst healthy people. They were the ones dying, and the insurance companies were having to pay out very unexpectedly, so unexpectedly that there was like this 40% increase in some of the insurance companies in the people who were dying in this, I think it was 25 to 55 age group. And so looking at that data, you might assume that these healthier people were making more spike protein, which of course is itself toxic. So if that was happening, then that would account for the deaths they saw in this highly professional group, and it would have accounted for the number of athletes that we see dropping dead on the, you know, the football field, the soccer field, whatever it is. And it would also speak to the myocarditis that the teenagers and young men were getting. So I don't know, again, I don't have a study done. I'm just telling you that looking at that made me think that the very elderly couldn't mount an immune response at all to the spike protein, and that the younger people often, because we do, I should back up a little bit. With the COVID vaccine, we are not getting a measured dose of antigen. What we're getting is a measured dose of the instructions to make the antigen. So it might be that the healthier your body is, the more of the antigen will make. If the antigen is toxic in and of itself, that's going to give you a lot of problems. And that may have happened with the elderly too, in that they might have died. They couldn't mount an immune response, but the spike protein could have been toxic to them too, except if they didn't make any, because their bodies weren't capable of it. That might have actually protected them a little bit. Again, I don't have hard data on this, but this is my working hypothesis, as we call it in the sciences. So only time will tell if that's correct or not. We do know, here's what we do know. There are people who are still making spike protein 2 years after taking the COVID shot. And why would that be? Well, one of the things is when they did the clinical trials for the COVID vaccine, they did it with one type of manufacturing process. When they rolled it out to the whole country, they changed the manufacturing process. And what happened when they did that is they got DNA fragments that they couldn't clean up in the manufacture of the widely distributed COVID vaccines. And because they had it, what they did, at least Pfizer did, is they put enzymes in the vaccine to chew up the DNA and make little fragments. But little fragments can be more easily incorporated into your own genome. And if that happened, that would explain why some people are still making spike protein 2 years later. And of course, they're in not very good physical condition because the thing is toxic. So this is, and I'm sharing this because, this was an experimental vaccine with an experimental process that did not have good control about what it was giving you, because nobody knew how each body would react. But you would predict from biology, if you've been in biology, that there'd be a lot of differences in how the body would react, depending on age, nutrition, this kind of thing. So I think that's why we had some problems there. Yes?
A couple of follow-up questions
Sure.
on the testing regime that you were talking about earlier. One of the objections I have heard to RFK's suggestion that we should test vaccines against SIBOs is that if you have a vaccine that you know to some extent is effective, to have people taking placebo, even thinking they might be getting that, would be unethical. Now, to me, that makes no sense. The point that you said with respect to a new vaccine, how can you, that makes no sense. But if you have a vaccine that's like a quote-unquote improvement over an existing one, that's based on that existing one, maybe it does make some sense, assuming that the existing one is truly safe, which is another question.
Yes.
So, I'll let you comment on that and I'll.
Sure. Well, first of all, Kennedy said that this would only be tested for new vaccines, not for the old ones, okay? So that takes care of that part of it. In other words, you can't make the ethical argument that,
Right.
you
Good.
can't use a placebo. Now, the problem is that instead of testing the new vaccine against a very similar vaccine for the same disease, that's not what happened. From what I have read, they tested them against a totally different vaccine, and a lot of times they only went out for like 5 days of testing. And, there's a couple of people in the country that are very high up in the vaccine, I guess you'd say, consultancy. And they testified under oath that 5 days was not enough to see things like autism or some of the other things that we saw on the chart. So there's really some question about how well they're tested. If you think about this for a minute, since the drug companies aren't liable from their perspective, why do extra work? So it's up to our regulatory agency to make sure that things are going, the testing is being done the way it would be appropriate. But of course, our FDA, since 1992, has been able to hire more employees because the Prescription Drug User Fee Act was passed. This was a fee that initially was optional for drug companies to pay, and the reason they pay it, I think the first year was $100,000. The reason that they would do it is because then a new examiner would be hired, and because they had put up the money, that examiner, or the examiner that had time, that company would get priority on their examination, which normally at that time was taking about 2 years. So now it's 70-some%, maybe more. Since I wrote Death by Regulation, I'm sure it's gone up. 70% of what the FDA examiners are paid comes from the user fees, which are now close to $3 million. And so when Vioxx was being considered to be put on the market, the examiner went to his boss and said, "We cannot put this on the market, it causes heart attacks." And his boss said, "No, the pharmaceutical industry is our client, so we are going to put it on the market." And then, of course, they had to withdraw it years later, and depending on whose estimate you look at, and I talk about this in Death by Regulation, the FDA is admitting to 160,000 deaths, I think, but if you look at the distribution, the wide distribution of Vioxx, you come up with a much higher number.
Our tax dollars at work.
Yeah. So what our tax dollars are working against us with things like stem cells, and they're working against us even when things are examined because of the huge conflict of interest that the FDA has with the Prescription Drug User Fee Act.
Okay, well, I think you've anticipated and answered my second question, but just to clarify, your objection to having a vaccine tested against a vaccine, it's not an absolute objection. There are circumstances where that would make sense.
Mhm.
It's just that the way that it's being done is not consistent with what would be the right way to do it.
Yes,
Is that correct?
and for the most part, they are not being tested long enough.
Or against the right.
Yeah, against the right,
vaccine.
yes. Yeah, I mean, if you had in other words, if you had a manufacturer that produced a vaccine against a disease and then they got what they thought was a better one, yeah, that might be a time to test against that, yeah. Yes.
In the past few years,
it developed the RSV vaccine.
Mhm.
And I know someone that was a subject of the trial on one of the companies. There was a placebo in that. What would the placebo be? Could it be saline solution, or
Yeah, it
could
could
it be
be.
another vaccine, or?
Well, I think there should be 2 placebos myself, so, because remember that the vaccine contains more than just the antigen. It contains aluminum, it might contain fetal embryonic cells.
Right.
There's like a list of about a dozen and a half of potential excipients in there. So my thought is that the best way to do it is to test the whole vaccine, the excipients without the antigen, and then placebo. Because in some cases, I don't think it's the antigen that's the problem. I think it's probably the, what we call the adjuvants or the excipients, yeah. So that would make more sense to me. Yes?
So one of the big vaccines in the last few years has been this HPV that they want every little girl to get before she's even sexually active. Is the science behind that legitimate? Is it really preventing cervical cancer, or?
It wasn't tested to prevent cervical cancer, it was tested to prevent, the condition that precedes it, and I can't remember what it was called now. Is there a doctor here who knows the answer to that, what it's called? The precursor.
Cervical hyperplasia?
Pardon me?
Cervical hyperplasia?
That could be it, yeah, that sounds right, okay.
But is it legitimate? Is there science backing this up?
Yeah.
Well, there's science backing the hyperplasia. There's not science backing that it prevents the cancer.
Well, there is a connection though between hyperplasia and cancer. And there is a connection between certain strains of the virus and cervical cancer, as I understand it. Whether, if anyone wants my opinion is that, the drug companies lobbied really hard with school districts and states to have it like, mandatory, like within those districts or states, and that is absolutely 100% like wrong. But the thing itself, you know, that's a completely different question. And I think the problem that we face a lot of times, we see the force being applied and we say that's absolutely wrong, so therefore this vaccine is terrible. It's not necessarily true. It could be the best vaccine in the world, and it's still wrong to be forced on people. And we shouldn't automatically assume a vaccine is bad just because the state wants to force people to take it. That's all.
But I think the HPV has been shown to have pretty bad side effects, so maybe
That's
more
not
than
cervical cancer.
Yes, oh, yeah, I know. But now the other option for ladies, of course, is to get a regular gynecological exam every year, which, you know, you don't have to worry that much about side effects, so. And I don't know I don't recall the percentage of reduction of the hyperplasia that's there, but that would be something to check. And, you know, you can go on the internet and find the package insert, and usually they have some summary of the studies and side effects and stuff, and, you know, that's, even if you're a layperson, you can look up any terms you don't understand, and then you can make your decision, you know. That's what informed consent should be.
Is there a benefit for a 4th grader to have this rather than 10th graders or whatever?
Yes.
People are.
Yes. If the vaccine is administered before any sexual contact or any possible transmission of the virus, there's a huge benefit, yes. And that's my
Point,
understanding.
parents don't want to do their 15 sexually active.
Right.
Which is why then they don't get the virus, they don't get the shot.
Stand up. Yes,
But then you don't have to have the difficult
Yes,
conversation with your kids.
So, can we take just the debate part maybe over so Mary can sell some books and?
No, but I was going to say something not, if we're winding up, I do want to grab that for sort of similar.
For the record, I also don't want to get cervical cancer.
I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Don't assume my gender.
I'm not assuming anything.
I'm happy to answer questions at my table too.
Thank you.
Yes.